the early hours of October 12, 1977, while fog still clung to the low hollers of western North Carolina, 3 men stood silently along a dirt access road and watched flames consume what had been the county's most carefully guarded secret. The moonshine still, hidden deep among pine and hardwood, burned hot and fast, metal warping, barrels splitting, smoke rising straight into a sky that offered no cover. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Everyone present understood the same thing. This was not a routine raid, and this would not end with a single arrest. In this part of the Carolinas, moonshine was never just illegal liquor. It was currency. It was survival. It was protection money, favors owed, promises kept. And every still operated under rules that weren't written down, but were enforced without mercy. That night, those rules were broken. Not by the state, not by a random patrol, but by someone who knew exactly where to look and exactly what would happen once the fire was lit. By sunrise, word had already spread through the county, not through newspapers or police radios, but through glances at gas stations, half-finished sentences at feed stores, and the sudden silence that followed whenever an unfamiliar truck pulled into a parking lot. Everyone asked the same question quietly. Who talked? Because it was immediately clear the still hadn't been found by chance. Someone had pointed the way. What most people didn't realize that morning was that the destruction of the still wasn't the beginning of the violence. It was the signal. Behind that patch of burned ground sat years of agreements, protection arrangements, shared profits, and unspoken threats. Moonshine operations in the region weren't isolated. They were networks, built on trust that was only tested when money disappeared or loyalties shifted. And this time, something had gone wrong badly enough that trust collapsed all at once. The sheriff would later describe the incident as a successful enforcement action, a routine operation disrupting illegal activity. But even as reports were written and filed away, other calculations were already happening. Who lost the most? Who had access to the location? Who stood to gain? By nightfall, the first quiet calls were made. No details exchanged, no names spoken, just confirmations that everyone understood what had happened and what it meant. One man, known for moving between crews and keeping everyone calm, packed a small bag that evening, expecting to be gone for a single night. He told his family he had business to handle, something minor, something that would be resolved by morning. He was never seen again. His disappearance wasn't reported immediately. In counties like this, men leaving town for a few days wasn't unusual. But as the days passed and no word came back, people began to understand that the fire in the woods had done more than destroy equipment. It had started something that could not be put out. What began as a broken deal had already turned into the opening move of a hidden war that would consume the county for years, leaving behind burned ground, missing men, and a silence that still hangs over the region decades later. By the second week after the still burned, the county had settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by caution rather than routine. Trucks that once traveled the same back roads at predictable hours began taking longer routes, arriving late or not at all. Conversations shortened. Men who had worked together for years suddenly avoided being seen in the same place. The disappearance of the first man wasn't announced, but it was understood. His name stopped coming up in public, and when it did, it was followed by a pause that said more than words ever could. People remembered the last time they'd seen him, where he'd parked his truck, who he'd been talking to, replaying small details that now felt dangerous to mention out loud. The sheriff's office took a report days later, a standard missing person entry that listed no suspects and offered no urgency. Adults disappeared in this part of the state all the time. The explanation went: work elsewhere, family trouble, drinking. The paperwork closed quickly. But outside official channels, the story moved fast. The still that burned had supplied more than one crew, and its destruction cut off cash flow that several families depended on. Worse, it exposed routes, drop points, and names that had been safe for years. Someone had sold access, and the people affected weren't interested in courtrooms or warrants. They wanted to know who broke the pact. Retaliation didn't come immediately. That would have drawn attention. Instead, it unfolded through quiet pressure. A truck vandalized overnight. A warning left in a mailbox. A hunting stand destroyed deep in the woods, where no outsider would ever wander. Each incident carried the same message. The people responsible were being identified, one by one, and everyone else was expected to stay out of it. The second man vanished near the end of October. He had been questioned privately by people he trusted, asked where he'd been the night the still was discovered, who he'd spoken to, who might have heard him complain about money. He denied everything, and for a while, it seemed the tension would pass. Then he failed to show up for a scheduled delivery. His truck was later found pulled off a logging road, keys still inside, door ajar. There were no signs of a struggle. There didn't need to be. After that, fear stopped being theoretical. Families began sending sons out of state to stay with relatives. Older men carried firearms openly again, something that hadn't happened in years. At night, headlights were watched carefully. The moonshine trade didn't stop, but it fractured, splintering into smaller, tighter groups that trusted no one outside their own blood. The sheriff received anonymous tips, vague and useless, pointing in every direction and none at all. He knew what was happening, but so did everyone else. Pushing too hard would only make it worse. This wasn't a crime wave. It was a reckoning. The third disappearance confirmed it. Unlike the others, this man had nothing to do with cooking or distribution. He was a middleman, someone who arranged protection, smoothed disputes, made sure the right people were paid. When he went missing, it sent a clear signal that no role was too small, no connection too distant. The war wasn't loud. There were no shootouts in the streets, no bodies left as warnings. Instead, the county learned to read absence as evidence. Empty chairs at kitchen tables, locked barns that never reopened, names erased from routines. And as the list quietly grew, one truth became unavoidable. Whoever had betrayed the still wasn't the only target. Anyone who knew the truth, or might know it, was now at risk. The violence had gone underground, and it was only beginning. As November set in and the hills turned bare, the pattern became impossible to ignore, even for those who wanted to pretend nothing was happening. The disappearances followed a logic that made sense only to people who understood how the moonshine economy really worked. These weren't random men. They were links. Each one connected crews, routes, money, or protection, and removing them one at a time collapsed entire chains without ever drawing attention to a single focal point. By mid-month, a fourth man failed to come home after an evening visit that was supposed to settle things quietly. He had been seen talking to two different groups in the days after the still burned, trying to calm tempers, trying to buy time. When his wife reported him missing, the sheriff delayed opening a case, advising patience, suggesting he might turn up once things cooled down. He never did. At that point, the county understood the rules had changed. This was no longer about finding the person who talked. It was about sealing the breach completely. The war had shifted from punishment to containment. Anyone who could reopen the wound was being removed from the board. Night driving became rare. People stopped answering knocks after dark unless they recognized the voice immediately. Churches emptied earlier. Stores closed before sundown. And beneath all of it ran a current of forced normalcy. The insistence that life go on as usual, because acknowledging fear would only invite more of it. The sheriff received pressure from outside agencies after the fourth disappearance, but he resisted escalation, insisting there was no evidence tying the cases together. Privately, he knew better. Publicly, he understood that a large investigation would freeze the county solid and push whatever was happening further out of reach. In late November, a fifth man vanished, and this time the message was unmistakable. He had no known enemies, no debts, no history of conflict. His only mistake was proximity. He had been present when conversations happened, when plans were discussed, when blame was quietly assigned. Removing him made it clear that innocence was no shield. Knowledge itself was the liability. That disappearance changed behavior overnight. People began burning old notebooks, destroying records, tearing up scraps of paper that might connect names to places. Moonshine operations went dark or moved deeper into the mountains, run by men who spoke to no one and trusted even less. Thanksgiving passed without gatherings. Christmas came and went quietly. By January of 1978, the county felt hollowed out. 6 men were gone. No arrests had been made. No bodies had been found. And yet, the violence had achieved something undeniable. The trade stabilized again, not because tensions were resolved, but because the cost of destabilizing it had been demonstrated too clearly to challenge. Those who remained understood the lesson. Silence wasn't just survival. It was participation. The war didn't need gunfire or headlines to continue. It advanced through restraint, through people choosing not to ask questions, not to follow up, not to look too closely at what had already disappeared. And as winter deepened, one last move was being prepared, not out of rage, but out of necessity, because unfinished business in a war like this was more dangerous than any open confrontation. By early February of 1978, the county existed in a state that could only be described as controlled exhaustion. The fear had settled into routine, and routine made it easier to hide what was still happening. People learned how to move through their days without drawing attention, how to speak in half statements, how to end conversations before they drifted too close to names that were no longer safe to say. It was during this period, when the tension felt almost stable, that the 6th man disappeared. And the timing was deliberate. He vanished after a meeting that many believed would finally end the cycle. A quiet sit-down arranged on neutral ground, meant to draw a line under everything that had followed the burning of the still. The men involved arrived separately, left separately, and for a brief moment it seemed like the war might end without another loss. Then one of them didn't make it home. His truck was found the next morning parked neatly off the road, as if he had pulled over willingly, the engine cold. No signs of haste, no signs of a struggle. That detail mattered. It told everyone watching that force hadn't been necessary, that compliance had been expected and given. The message was clear. Cooperation was no longer optional. By removing someone directly connected to the attempt at peace, whoever was directing the violence made it clear that the war would end on their terms, not through negotiation. The sheriff, now facing mounting pressure from the state, authorized limited searches that produced nothing but false reassurance. Deputies walked wooded areas they already knew too well, noted rough terrain and poor visibility, and returned with reports that sounded thorough without ever threatening to uncover anything real. Privately, some admitted there were places they would not enter, areas of land controlled by people who had already demonstrated what happened when boundaries were crossed. In March, the 7th disappearance occurred, and by then it almost felt procedural. The man had been warned indirectly, through friends, through changes in tone, through opportunities to leave that he chose not to take. When he vanished, no one was surprised. His family waited days before contacting authorities, hoping against hope that he had taken the hint and left town on his own. He hadn't. That disappearance finally broke the illusion that this could fade out quietly. Too many men were gone. Too many families were affected. State investigators arrived with the intent to impose order, but they quickly encountered a wall that no warrant could penetrate. Witnesses remembered nothing useful. Timelines blurred. Alibis overlapped just enough to collapse under scrutiny without ever snapping. The moonshine trade itself had already adapted, restructured around tighter circles and deeper secrecy, leaving nothing obvious to disrupt. And then, just as suddenly as the disappearances had begun, they stopped. No 8th man went missing. No final act announced the end. The war simply withdrew, having accomplished what it set out to do. The still that burned in October had been avenged not through spectacle, but through removal, each absence reinforcing the same lesson until no one needed reminding anymore. By the summer of 1978, the county returned to something resembling normal life. But it was a thinner version of what existed before. Quieter, more cautious, shaped by the understanding that what had happened was not chaos, but correction. And that understanding would linger long after the smoke from that first fire had faded into memory. In the Sarikiofawiv months that followed, the absence left behind by the war proved more influential than the violence itself. With no new disappearances, outsiders assumed the situation had resolved on its own. Another rural mystery that burned hot and then cooled without explanation. Inside the county, the understanding was different. The still that had ignited everything was never rebuilt in its original form, not because people stopped making moonshine, but because no one wanted to recreate the conditions that had made betrayal possible. Operations became smaller, more isolated, controlled by blood ties rather than convenience. Routes changed. Drop points shifted deeper into land that outsiders avoided instinctively. The sheriff closed his files quietly, each case ending with the same language about lack of evidence and voluntary absence. Phrases that satisfied procedure without provoking retaliation. Families learned how to live with unanswered questions, how to explain empty chairs and unfinished routines without inviting follow-ups. Some moved away, others stayed, bound to the land despite everything it had taken. In late 1979, a state review attempted to reopen several of the cases, prompted by changes in leadership and renewed pressure to account for the missing men. Investigators arrived with fresh eyes and modern tools, but they encountered the same problem that had stalled earlier efforts. Nothing had been left behind. No bodies, no witnesses willing to speak beyond vague recollections, no financial trails that hadn't already been burned away. What they did find was a county that functioned differently than it had before, governed by rules that were never discussed openly, but were obeyed without hesitation. The moonshine trade continued, quieter and more efficient, generating fewer conflicts and attracting less attention. People addressed disputes early, face to face, before resentment had time to grow. Silence, once mistaken for approval, was now treated as a warning. Those lessons weren't taught formally. They were absorbed through observation, through stories that were never finished, through the knowledge that something had gone very wrong once, and that it would not be allowed to happen again. Even decades later, When reporters and researchers tried to reconstruct the events of 1977, they ran into the same invisible barrier. Records were incomplete, memories conflicted, names that mattered were never spoken. The burning of the still survived as a reference point rather than a story, the moment when everyone understood how fragile their system was and how quickly it could turn on itself. The hidden war left no monuments, no anniversaries, no official acknowledgement. Its legacy lived in restraint, in the careful maintenance of balance, in the way people chose stability over justice. Because justice, in this case, would have required reopening wounds that had already cost too much. What began with a broken pact ended with an unspoken agreement shared by everyone who remained. Some things were better left untouched, and some fires, once lit, could only be extinguished by letting them burn all the way through. By the early 1980s, the story had thinned into something people referenced without ever explaining. A shared memory stripped of detail, but heavy with implication. Newcomers noticed it first, the way conversations tightened when certain years were mentioned, the way directions avoided specific hollers without saying why, the way older men corrected small mistakes immediately instead of letting them linger. Those adjustments weren't superstition. They were preventative. Everyone understood that the violence of 1977 hadn't erupted because people were reckless, but because they were patient for too long, allowing resentment to ferment until correction required removal instead of negotiation. That understanding reshaped behavior more effectively than any prosecution ever could. When a dispute over territory flared in 1981, it was settled publicly within days. Not because tempers were cooler, but because the cost of delay was now understood. The moonshine economy itself reflected the change. Crews no longer pooled resources across loose alliances. Trust was limited, access was compartmentalized, and anyone who asked too many questions found themselves quietly excluded before curiosity could turn dangerous. The sheriff's office benefited from the shift without ever acknowledging it. Calls dropped. Anonymous tips dried up. What had once been a constant low-grade tension resolved into a predictable quiet. That quiet was not peace in the conventional sense, but it was stability, and stability was valued above all else. Families of the missing men learned to navigate a strange limbo, grieving without funerals, remembering without markers. Some accepted unofficial explanations offered privately, fragments that suggested their loved ones had been taken care of in ways that prevented further harm. Others refused any version that didn't include answers, but even they learned where the limits were. Pushing too hard isolated them socially. Cutting off support they still needed to survive. Over time, silence became communal, a shared burden carried lightly enough to endure. When national attention briefly brushed the county during a broader investigation into illegal alcohol distribution, officials found nothing that warranted deeper inquiry. The networks had adapted, and whatever evidence once existed had been erased by time and intention. Reporters left with thin copy and unanswered questions, concluding there was no story strong enough to pursue. Locally, that outcome was considered success. The absence of scrutiny confirmed that the balance held. By the time the decade closed, the hidden war had fully transformed from event to condition, something that explained how things were done without ever being discussed. The still that burned in October of 1977 was remembered not for what it produced, but for what it destroyed. The illusion that trust could be stretched indefinitely without consequence. The men who disappeared were spoken of only obliquely, their absence functioning as boundary markers rather than unresolved mysteries. And in that way, the county moved forward, not healed, but calibrated, living with the knowledge that the most dangerous conflicts were the ones allowed to remain quiet for too long, and that once the line was crossed, the response would not be loud, dramatic, or brief. It would be methodical, finite, and designed to ensure it never had to happen again. As years passed, the events of 1977 receded further from public view, but they never loosened their grip on the county's internal logic. The men who had enforced the correction aged quietly, some dying of illness, others moving away, carrying details that would never be written down. Yet the absence of those details didn't weaken the lesson. If anything, it made it stronger. Without a fixed narrative to argue against, what remained was behavior, a collective instinct to intervene early, to confront problems before they hardened into something unmanageable. Younger men learned this without being taught, absorbing it through observation rather than explanation. They noticed which deals were never made on trust alone, which favors required witnesses, which boundaries were acknowledged without discussion. The moonshine trade persisted, but it no longer relied on optimism. It ran on caution. That caution extended beyond alcohol. Land disputes, hunting rights, family disagreements, all were handled faster, louder, and in daylight, precisely to avoid the quiet buildup that had once led to disappearance. Outside authorities occasionally circled back, driven by new policies or renewed interest in unresolved cases. But every attempt collapsed under the same weightless resistance. There were no lies to expose, only the absence of usable truth. Everyone remembered, enough to avoid mistakes, but not enough to incriminate anyone. That selective memory wasn't coordinated. It was shared. Even families who had lost sons or husbands participated in it, not out of approval, but out of survival. Reopening the past promised no justice, only renewed instability. And stability, however fragile, was worth protecting. By the late 1980s, the county had become an example cited quietly among neighboring regions, a place where things had gone too far once and never would again. No one said this openly. It traveled as rumor, as warning, as shorthand. The still that burned became symbolic, not as an act of law enforcement or betrayal, but as the moment when a system revealed how it corrected itself when patience ran out. What followed wasn't chaos, but consolidation. Power concentrated into fewer hands, decisions became more deliberate, and the margin for error narrowed. The war had ended not because it was won, but because it had achieved its objective. It had removed uncertainty. It had demonstrated consequence. And it had done so in a way that left nothing to dismantle afterward. No monuments marked the cost. No anniversaries honored the dead. The county carried on, outwardly unchanged, inwardly altered. Visitors passed through without noticing anything unusual. Only those who stayed long enough learned the subtle rules, the invisible fences that kept things in place. And those fences, built from absence rather than force, proved more durable than any written law. The hidden war faded into the background of daily life, not forgotten, but integrated, shaping decisions long after the last search ended and the last file was closed. It remained as a reminder that some conflicts do not announce themselves with gunfire or headlines, but with silence, and that once silence is mistaken for safety, the correction that follows may be quiet, comprehensive, and final. By the time a full decade had passed, the war no longer existed as a sequence of events, only as an underlying pressure that shaped how the county functioned. People who were children in 1977 grew up sensing that something fundamental had happened long before they were old enough to understand it. A shift that explained why adults reacted so quickly to small conflicts, why certain subjects were redirected without argument, why some stretches of land were left alone without explanation. When they asked, They were told practical things. It wasn't worth the trouble. It caused problems before. It never ends well. The explanations were sufficient because the consequences were visible in what never happened. There were no more waves of disappearances, no sudden collapses of trust. The system had learned its limits. When economic pressure returned in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as mills closed and work dried up, the county adapted without fracturing. Moonshine production increased again, but it did so under tighter controls, fewer participants, and rules that were enforced early rather than retroactively. The sheriff's office, staffed by men who had grown up watching the fallout, understood their role differently. Enforcement focused on containment, not confrontation. Disruption without humiliation. It kept the peace precisely because it avoided forcing the kind of choices that had once led to war. Families of the missing men continued to live with unresolved loss, but even that pain was shaped by the understanding that digging for answers risked reopening something no one believed could be controlled a second time. Memorials were private. Grief was contained. Over time, the missing were spoken of less as victims and more as markers, reference points that explained why things were done the way they were. When researchers later tried to reconstruct the Moonshine Wars of the Carolinas, they found records of raids and seizures, but nothing that captured the true cost of 1977. That cost wasn't measured in gallons destroyed or arrests made. It was measured in absence, in caution, in the way an entire county learned to police itself through restraint rather than force. The burning of one still had revealed how fragile the balance really was, and how quickly it could collapse when trust was stretched too thin. The correction that followed was brutal, but it was finite, designed not to repeat itself. That design succeeded. The hidden war ended not with justice or closure, but with equilibrium, an uneasy stability maintained through shared memory and selective silence. And long after the smoke cleared and the names faded from conversation, that equilibrium held, quietly enforcing the lesson that some deals, once broken, could never be repaired, only buried along with the men who paid the price for believing otherwise. Even decades later, when the physical landscape had changed just enough to hide the scars, the internal map of the county remained fixed. Roads were paved, old farms sold, new families moved in without knowing what had once happened in the trees beyond their property lines. But the underlying order never loosened. People who had lived through 1977 could feel when tension began to gather again, recognizing the early signs the way others recognized weather. A disagreement left unresolved, a favor taken for granted, silence where there should have been clarification. Those moments were addressed quickly now, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes harshly, but always before patience had time to rot into resentment. That reflex was the war's true legacy. It didn't create fear that paralyzed the community. It created vigilance that preserved it. Every so often, someone from outside would hear fragments of the story and assume the county was ruled by violence, that disappearances were an accepted solution. That assumption was wrong. What happened after the still burned was not indulgence in brutality. It was containment, an extreme correction triggered by accumulated neglect. And once the correction was complete, the system retreated, leaving behind rules that prevented it from ever being needed again. The men who vanished were not glorified, and they were not discussed as warnings. They existed as absences that explained why certain lines were never crossed twice. That absence carried more weight than any threat could have. Over time, even the moonshine trade lost its centrality. It became one activity among many rather than the backbone of survival. But the habits formed during the war carried over into everything else. Deals were documented. Witnesses were included. Trust was granted carefully and withdrawn quickly. The idea that silence equaled consent was gone for good. When conflicts did arise, they were handled openly, sometimes loudly, because open conflict was safer than quiet drift. The county's reputation eventually softened, becoming known not for violence, but for stability, a place where disputes rarely escalated beyond words. Few outsiders understood that this stability had been purchased at a cost that no one wanted to recount. The war itself faded into near invisibility, surviving only in half-finished anecdotes and the way older residents changed the subject when pressed for details. There was no anniversary, no marker, no collective reckoning. There was only continuity. The burning of one still had forced the county to confront what happened when informal systems were ignored too long. The response had been decisive, methodical, and final. And once it was done, it was never repeated. That restraint, learned the hard way, proved stronger than any enforcement campaign. It allowed the county to move forward without reopening wounds that could never heal cleanly. In the end, the Carolina Moonshine War of 1977 was not remembered as a series of violent acts, but as the moment when a community learned exactly how fragile its balance was and how carefully it had to be maintained to prevent silence from becoming dangerous again. In the final reckoning, the events set in motion by the burning of that still never resolved in the way outsiders expected, because there was no courtroom ending, no confession, no official narrative to close the book. What endured instead was a form of quiet governance, a shared understanding that some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed without cost. The county never denied what had happened, but it also never affirmed it publicly, choosing instead to live with the consequences in ways that reduced the chance of repetition. That choice shaped everything that followed. Children grew up in homes where arguments were settled quickly, where grudges were addressed directly, where silence was treated as something dangerous rather than polite. Men who entered the trade later did so with fewer illusions, understanding that the real risk was never the law, but the collapse of trust among people who depended on each other to survive. Over time, the memory of specific faces blurred, but the structure remained intact, guiding behavior without requiring explanation. The sheriff's office continued its work, enforcing statutes while respecting the limits imposed by history, aware that pressing too hard in the wrong direction could destabilize what had taken years to rebuild. Families who had lost someone carried their grief privately, marking time not with anniversaries, but with absence, adjusting to lives that no longer included answers. And still, the county functioned. It worked. It endured. Visitors passed through without noticing anything unusual, unaware that the calm they experienced was not accidental, but earned. The war that followed the broken pact did not end with victory or defeat, but with calibration, a hard reset that redefined how much pressure could be allowed to accumulate before action became unavoidable. That calibration held because it was never tested again. No new still was burned in betrayal. No new chain of disappearances followed. The lesson had been learned too clearly to ignore. And so the story of the Carolina Moonshine War of 1977 remains what it has always been to those who lived through it. Not a tale meant to be told, but a boundary meant to be respected. A reminder that in places governed as much by unwritten rules as by law, the most dangerous moment is not when violence erupts, but when silence is mistaken for safety. Once that mistake was corrected, the county chose not to repeat it, carrying forward a fragile equilibrium built on restraint, memory, and the shared understanding that some fires, once lit, should never be allowed to burn again. Years later, When the story occasionally surfaced outside the county in fragments and speculation, it was often misunderstood as something explosive that must have burned itself out in a single season. That interpretation missed what made it endure. The war's real impact was not the number of men who vanished or the still that burned, but the behavioral shift that followed, the permanent change in how risk was assessed and how trust was handled. The people who lived there learned to recognize the early warning signs long before they became visible to anyone else. And that awareness became a kind of shared intelligence, passed quietly from one generation to the next. New deals were explained carefully. Old grievances were settled early. Disputes that might once have been allowed to simmer were confronted directly, sometimes uncomfortably, but always before resentment had time to calcify. That discipline was not imposed by fear of punishment, but by memory of consequence. Even as industries changed and the county modernized, the internal rules adapted rather than disappeared, integrating with formal systems without ever yielding their authority. Law enforcement benefited from this arrangement without naming it, finding that fewer crises emerged because fewer were allowed to develop. When problems did arise, they were smaller, more contained, resolved without drawing lines that could not be erased. Families who had lost someone carried a complicated understanding of what had happened, one that resisted simplification. Some believed the correction had saved others from a wider collapse. Others saw only loss without redemption. Both views existed side by side, held in check by the recognition that reopening the past offered no path to repair. The absence of public reckoning was not denial, but a decision, made repeatedly, to prioritize stability over narrative. Over time, the Carolina Moonshine War of 1977 became less a story than a reference point, a moment that explained why things were done the way they were, why silence was treated with suspicion, why promises were documented rather than assumed. It served as a boundary rather than a lesson, respected without being rehearsed. The still that burned that October morning no longer mattered as an object, but as a signal. The instant when patience ran out and the system revealed how it corrected imbalance when left no other choice. After that correction, the system withdrew, leaving behind a calm that looked ordinary to outsiders and felt carefully maintained to those who understood its origin. In the end, what remained was not a myth or warning told aloud, but an equilibrium sustained through restraint, a shared commitment to never let pressure build unchecked again. That commitment, quiet and enduring, is why the war did not repeat itself, and why the county learned to live with its history not by retelling it, but by preventing the conditions that once made it unavoidable. By the time the story reached the present day, it existed almost entirely as an absence, rather than a memory, shaping behavior without demanding attention. The men who could have spoken most clearly were gone, either buried by time or bound by a silence that had outlived the fear that created it. What remained was a county that understood itself differently than it had before 1977, aware of how quickly patience could be mistaken for weakness, and how costly that misunderstanding could become. That awareness did not harden people into suspicion. It sharpened them into attentiveness. Small signals were noticed. Agreements were clarified. Boundaries were reinforced early before they could be tested. The moonshine trade, once central to survival, faded into a background activity. Its influence diminished, but its lessons intact. Law enforcement continued to operate in the open, but always with an awareness of the informal order that surrounded it. A balance that worked precisely because it was never challenged head-on. Families of the missing men learned to live with a truth that could not be articulated publicly, carrying private grief alongside a communal decision to move forward without reopening what had already taken too much. Outsiders who stumbled onto fragments of the story often searched for a final revelation, a missing piece that would turn rumor into resolution, but there was none to find. The Carolina Moonshine War of 1977 did not end with answers because answers were never the objective. What mattered was outcome. A broken pact had exposed a fault line, and the response, however harsh, sealed it. After that, the system withdrew, leaving behind a quiet stability that required constant maintenance and collective restraint. That restraint proved more durable than fear or force, preserving an equilibrium that endured long after the original conflict faded from conversation. In that sense, the war was not remembered as a tragedy with a lesson to be taught, but as a correction that had served its purpose and did not need repeating. The still that burned was never rebuilt, not because it could not be, but because no one wanted to test what might follow. And so the county carried on, outwardly ordinary, inwardly calibrated, guided by the shared understanding that silence was never neutral, and that some mistakes, once made, could only be answered once. In the end, the Carolina Moonshine War did not conclude with a final act that could be pointed to as an ending. There was no last disappearance that closed the ledger, no announcement that the balance had been restored. What ended it was saturation, the moment when everyone involved understood that the message had been delivered completely, and that any further action would risk tearing open something that had already been sealed at great cost. The men who remained adjusted their lives around that understanding, changing how they moved, how they spoke, and who they trusted. Younger generations inherited those adjustments without ever being told their origin, sensing only that certain mistakes carried consequences that no one wanted to revisit. Over time, the war became invisible, not because it was denied, but because it had been absorbed into the structure of daily life. The absence of noise, of scandal, of repeated violence was the proof that it had worked. Deals were made, carefully or not at all. Disputes were addressed early, in daylight, with witnesses present. Silence was no longer allowed to stretch long enough to be misread. The county did not become safer because it forgot what happened, but because it remembered it in the only way that mattered, through behavior. The still that burned on that October morning remained a quiet reference point, a reminder of how quickly an unwritten system could turn on itself when trust was abused. And so the story ends where it began, not with flames or gunfire, but with restraint. A community chose stability over explanation, equilibrium over exposure, and in doing so ensured that the war it endured would not become a template for the future. What was lost could not be recovered, and what was done could not be undone. But the lesson held. In places where survival depends on cooperation more than law, the most dangerous moment is not the act of violence itself, but the silence that comes before it. Once that silence was broken and answered, the county learned to keep it from ever becoming dangerous again. What ultimately made the Carolina Moonshine War fade from view was not forgiveness, but exhaustion. The collective recognition that the cost of reopening old wounds outweighed any satisfaction that truth might bring. By the early 1990s, even the most determined outsiders had stopped trying to piece together what had happened, deterred by missing records, inconsistent memories, and a community that offered cooperation without substance. The war had left no clear villains to prosecute, no bodies to exhume, no evidence that could survive scrutiny. What it had left behind was a county that functioned with an almost clinical awareness of its own limits. People spoke more plainly. Promises were clarified. Ambiguity was treated as a threat rather than a convenience. The moonshine economy, once a web of overlapping loyalties, became fragmented and cautious, its participants unwilling to rely on anyone they could not hold accountable directly. That shift rippled outward, affecting how land was leased, how debts were handled, how disputes were settled long before they became personal. Even law enforcement adapted quietly, learning when to intervene and when restraint served the greater good. The families of the missing men continued to live with unanswered questions, but they also lived with the knowledge that pressing for closure could destabilize lives that had already absorbed enough loss. Their silence was not approval, but a calculation shaped by survival. Over time, that calculation became communal. The war receded into something like a shared instinct, an understanding that order in places like this was not maintained by spectacle or punishment, but by boundaries that everyone agreed not to test again. The still that burned in October of 1977 was remembered less as an act of betrayal than as the moment when patience failed and the system revealed how it corrected imbalance when pushed too far. After that correction, it withdrew completely, leaving behind an equilibrium that endured precisely because it was never challenged. The county moved forward, not cleansed, not absolved, but calibrated, aware of how quickly silence could become dangerous and how deliberately it had to be managed. And that awareness, carried quietly through decades of change, ensured that the Carolina Moonshine War remained what it was always meant to be: a singular rupture, absorbed into the fabric of the place, never explained fully and never repeated. In recent years, as interest in forgotten rural conflicts has resurfaced through documentaries and online archives, the Carolina Moonshine War has occasionally been pulled back into partial light, examined by people far removed from the place and time where it unfolded. What they often struggle to understand is that the lack of clear resolution is not an oversight or a failure of investigation, but the natural endpoint of a conflict that was never meant to be resolved publicly. Records from the period show enforcement actions, seizures, patrol logs, but they stop short of acknowledging the chain reaction that followed the burn still, because acknowledging it would have required naming a system that operated outside formal authority. Interviews conducted decades later tend to collapse into the same pattern, recollections that circle the truth without landing on it, statements that confirm the atmosphere without confirming the acts. To outsiders, this reads like evasion. To those who lived through it, it is preservation. The county did not survive by exposing everything that happened. It survived by absorbing it. That distinction explains why, even now, when the immediate danger has long passed, the boundaries remain intact. Certain names are avoided, certain places are described vaguely, certain years are referenced only in passing. The caution is no longer driven by fear of retaliation, but by recognition of how fragile the balance can be when old grievances are disturbed without purpose. Younger residents, raised far removed from the violence, still inherit this restraint, not through instruction, but through example, noticing how quickly elders shut down speculation, how firmly they redirect curiosity toward safer ground. The war has become a negative space in the county's history, shaping what is said by what is not. And that absence is intentional. It ensures that the conflict remains singular, not inspirational, not replicable. The still that burned was not the first illegal operation in the hills, and it was not the last. But it was the one that exposed what happened when informal rules were treated as flexible rather than binding. The response that followed corrected that assumption permanently. There was no appetite afterward for myth-making or justification. There was only a shared understanding that what had occurred was sufficient, that no further explanation would improve the outcome. As time continues to stretch the distance between then and now, The Carolina Moonshine War remained suspended in that space between memory and silence. A reminder that some histories endure not because they are told again and again, but because the behavior they produced continues to function exactly as intended. What separates the Carolina Moonshine War from the countless other rural disputes that flared and faded across the South is not the violence itself, but the discipline that followed it, the collective decision to treat what happened as a limit rather than a story. In many places, conflict becomes folklore, retold and reshaped until it loses its weight. Here, the opposite happened. The events of 1977 were allowed to sink into the ground like spent shell casings, acknowledged only through behavior that made repetition unnecessary. That restraint created a strange durability. Even as demographics shifted and economic pressures returned in new forms, the county never slipped back into the same pattern. When disagreements arose, they were confronted earlier and more openly, not because people were braver, but because they understood the alternative. Silence had once been mistaken for tolerance, and the cost of that mistake had been paid in full. That payment was not forgotten, even as the details faded. It lived on in the way people chose witnesses, in the way deals were narrowed and clarified, in the way trust was rationed carefully rather than given freely. The moonshine trade itself eventually lost its centrality, replaced by other work, other risks, other compromises. But the habits forged during the war remained useful across all of it. Law enforcement, too, absorbed the lesson without naming it. Officers learned when to apply pressure and when restraint preserved order better than force. Investigations focused on preventing escalation rather than extracting confessions, a shift that kept the county functional without reopening scars that could not heal cleanly. Families of the missing men continued to exist in a quiet tension between loss and acceptance, knowing that public answers were unlikely, and that private ones, if they existed at all, would not bring relief. Their grief became part of the landscape, unmarked but enduring. And so, the Carolina Moonshine War never concluded in the traditional sense. It resolved itself through adaptation, through the gradual alignment of behavior around a shared understanding of risk and consequence. The still that burned that October morning served its final purpose not by what it destroyed, but by what it revealed. It exposed the fragility of trust and the speed with which informal systems can turn corrective when pushed too far. After that revelation, the system withdrew, leaving behind a calm that required constant attention but rarely failed. In that way, the war did not echo forward through repeated violence. It echoed through restraint. And that restraint, practiced quietly for decades, ensured that what happened once would remain singular, absorbed into the place itself. A boundary remembered not through stories told aloud, but through choices made every day to keep silence from becoming dangerous again. In the final years before those who remembered the war firsthand began to disappear themselves, the county reached a quiet consensus about how the past would be carried forward. It would not be taught as a lesson, framed as a warning, or shaped into a story with heroes and villains. It would exist only as an internal reference, a shared awareness that shaped decisions before they ever became visible. That choice ensured the conflict would never be misunderstood as something to imitate or romanticize. The Carolina Moonshine War of 1977 was allowed to remain unresolved by design, because resolution would have required exposure, and exposure would have risked unraveling the stability that followed. What mattered was not who had spoken, who had burned the still, or who had given the final order. What mattered was that the system had revealed its breaking point and then recalibrated itself so that point would never be reached again. The still that burned became less important than the silence that followed it, a silence maintained not through fear, but through discipline and memory. As decades passed, the county changed in all the ways rural places do: new roads, new faces, new pressures. But the underlying rule held. Problems were addressed early. Assumptions were challenged. Silence was never allowed to stretch unchecked. Those habits outlived the men who enforced them, becoming part of the place itself. And that is why the war never truly ended, but also never returned. It concluded not with justice, not with truth, but with restraint. A collective decision to live within limits that had been learned at too high a cost to forget. What began with one broken pact ended with a boundary that held for generations, ensuring that the fire lit in the woods in 1977 would never need to be answered again.